of the Women's Studies program at Worcester State College, I'd like to welcome you to the Candace Allen Scholar Memorial Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kay Soisa, Director of Women's Studies. This annual lecture honors Candace Allen Scholar, a Worcester State student who was murdered in her own home in July 2002. The Women's Studies program established the college's annual lecture in her memory, and this talk occurs every October and is the highlight of our Month Without Violence series. Today, we have Dr. Oliva M. Espín as our guest speaker. Dr. Espín is Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at San Diego State University and Professor Emerita of Psychology at Alliant International University, formerly known as the California School of Professional Psychology in San Diego. She specializes in the psychology of Latinas, immigrant and refugee women, women's sexuality across cultures, and qualitative research methodology. Dr. Espín has trained psychotherapists and worked as a feminist therapist for many years. A native of Cuba, Dr. Espín has lived and worked in several countries. She received the 1991 Award for Distinguished Professional Contribution to Public Service from the American Psychological Association and the 2001 Distinguished Career Award from the Association for Women in Psychology. Dr. Espín is a renowned scholar who regularly presents her work at national and international conferences. She's the author of Latina Healers, Lives of Power and Tradition, Latina Realities, Essays on Healing, Migration, and Sexuality, and Women Crossing Boundaries, The Psychology of Immigration and Transformations of Sexuality. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to present Dr. Oliva M. Espín.
Thank you, Kay, for the introduction and for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for being here. Okay. I'm going to talk sort of about an hour, and then I'll leave some time at the end for questions. So if there are some things that come up, just write down a little note, and then you can, ask me later. So, although the experiences of women, can you all hear me? Okay. Although the experiences of women in international migration have begun to draw attention from researchers, policymakers, service providers, and the public at large, there's still a lot to learn about this group. Sometimes what passes for knowledge about immigrant women is nothing more than an accumulation of preconceived ideas. One such area of confusion is the issue of domestic violence in immigrant populations. No matter how strong the similarities in the experience of migration, vast differences are also present. Differences originate in the dissimilar countries of birth, ages at migration, historical period when the migration took place, circumstances surrounding it, and the consequences of the process for each individual life. Let us explore some of the similar and different experience among immigrant women before addressing the issue of domestic violence. As migrants cross borders, they also cross emotional and behavioral boundaries. Becoming a member of a new society stretches the boundaries of what is possible. One's life and roles change. With them, identities change. Everyone living in a given place is unavoidably shaped by it and therefore indebted to it. Most immigrants and refugees crossing geographical borders rarely anticipate the emotional and behavioral boundaries they will confront. At each step of the migration process, women and men encounter different experiences. Women's roles and sexual behavior may be modified more dramatically and profoundly than men's. For both heterosexual and lesbian women, the crossing of borders through migration provides the space and permission to cross emotional boundaries and transform their gender roles. Displacement may empower women to develop new selves. However, this is usually not a smooth process, even for those women who seem to have acculturated easily to the new society. This is not an easy process. Women who migrate from traditional societies may find that new alternatives open to them in the new country. But the new possibilities are not limited to women from traditional societies. Women who migrate from modern societies may also find that alternatives open for them because of the distance from the familiar environment and or their families. Regardless of differences in the countries of birth, many women appear to benefit from the liberating effect of being outsiders in the new culture. The opportunities in work, education, and routines of life provided by the migration are present in women's studies. Women's gender roles may shift because of their relocation to a country with more egalitarian gender norms, but also because of the necessity of their greater participation in the workforce. Women work always in their countries, in their homes, etc. But when they come to a new country, sometimes they start working for wages for the first time. Not always, but sometimes. Immigrant women's employment may change their identity and their family's dynamic in considerable ways because it may entail women's increasing bargaining power due to their increasing economic contributions. This new financial independence may provide a chance to leave unsatisfying partnerships or to improve their gender role status by increasing control over household decisions. In other words, migration offers women the opportunity to transgress established gender roles, and it can be an impetus for women to challenge traditional roles and power structures. But migration can also contribute to a situation where immigrant women and men embrace more traditional roles while embodying a reimagined home culture in the new country. Women are viewed in many societies as keepers and transmitters of culture, and consequently may experience increased pressures to focus on their families after relocation, often at the expense of their own well-being. Migration carries with it the possibility of limiting women's private spheres of influence and their moral authority. Traditional patriarchal contexts have always provided the opportunity to carve separate, if inferior, spaces for women. The cultural transformations brought about by migration upset these spaces without yet giving women full access to equal power in the public sphere. Immigrant women frequently encounter intergenerational conflict with their children and older family members who adhere to traditional roles and cultural values to a far lesser or far greater degree. Various social and cultural antecedents, such as previous trauma or challenges to maintain traditional families, such as having left their children behind, may also place boundaries on women's ability to transgress culturally prescribed gender roles. In fact, some immigrants of both sexes subscribe to the traditional ideas of male superiority and its consequent forms of expression, but many reject it outright. Let us remember that there are many immigrant women who are actively involved in activism and who are unwilling to submit to the authorities of male relatives. Indeed, migration can be both emancipatory and subjugating for women. Gains seem to be more pronounced in the economic domain, whereas gender subordination may continue in different forms. In any case, for both women and men, new learning opportunities emerge as host societies, institutional structures, interact with the psychological equipment immigrants bring and create in the host society. Successfully negotiating these new identities and relationships occurs at many levels and depends on a variety of contextual factors. As immigration researchers tell us, it is important to acknowledge that although household members' orientations and actions may sometimes be guided by norms of solidarity, they may equally be informed by hierarchies of power along gender and generational lines. The impact of migration on gender relations and the impact of gender power structures on the migratory process cannot be ignored if we are to have a clearer picture on how immigration intersect with women individuals' psychological processes. To fully grasp the interplay of gender and the migratory process, it is important to understand that even though women migrate for a whole range of reasons, such as poverty, displacement for the land, debt, and many other constraints that they share with men, the impact of these problems is always gender because of the impact of specific problems, such as wage differentials in sender areas and receiving areas. Indeed, all women face the constraints of sex segregation in employment, both in the home country and in this country. In addition to these common economic needs and their gender consequences, some non-economic factors are especially important causes of migration for women. Social constraints facing women also influences selectivity in migration streams. Marital discord and physical violence, unhappy marriages, and the impossibility of divorce in some countries, and other instances of sexual or gender oppression often influence women's decision to migrate. Women's agency, viewed within the context of resisting oppression and exploitative structures, is particularly vital for a gendered account of migration, because it is so often assumed that women simply follow men, and that their role in migration is reactive rather than proactive. In other words, it is important to keep in mind the extent to which women's migration is not simply an enforced response to economic hardships or about wives following husbands, but it also may be a deliberate, calculated move on the part of the individual woman to escape from a society where patriarchy is more institutionalized and more repressive. Therefore, so-called cultural issues such as concerns with the body, sexuality, and representation might also be significant for a gendered account of migration. One example to clarify this, for instance, women from the Andes, when they come to Lima or to Quito to work, usually cut their hair. And you would say, what's the big deal of the length of your hair? But it's a statement about acculturation. And we all know from all the controversies that we have heard, mostly in Europe, but somewhat here also, about women using scarves. Is it good, is it not, is it resistance, is it acculturation, is it, there are lots of things that have to do with those things that seem to be so very superficial in your decision about the length of your hair or what you're going to put on your head. Okay? That is very gender because men don't get into that. Something interesting, and there were a number of years ago, there was an exhibit at the Chicago Historical Society about Jewish immigrants at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things that was more significant in that population was that young women who were starting to work in the factories saved their pennies, and they were paid pennies, saved their pennies to buy hats. So they did not have to use the same thing that their mothers or themselves were using, covering their head. The thing was buying a hat. You know, think of 20th century beginning hats. That was like a demonstration that now they were American. And that again is very gender. So it's an interesting thing to keep in mind. We cannot ignore the impact of immigrant women's regular wage work on gender relations. Employed immigrant women generally gain greater personal autonomy and independence. Women's regular access to wages and their greater contribution to household sustenance frequently lead to more control over other realms of domestic decision-making. Many women learn to contest the patriarchal narratives of ethnic solidarity and thus change the content of some of those narratives. It is therefore essential to keep in mind that households are not the cozy, rational decision-making units that neoclassical economies would lead us to believe. Migration decisions reflect the power relations within the household and are influenced by both individual as well as collective interests. Conversely, or it's important to keep in mind that much is made about the incidence of male dominance in immigrant cultures by individuals of the whole society. And it is important to remember that any expression of male dominance among immigrants is nothing but the specific culture's version of the myth of male superiority that exists in practically all cultures, including mainstream American culture. Frequently, women are made to carry cultural values at the expense of their own lives. Cultural pressures to be the bearers of culture may significantly stress the lives of immigrant women from various ethnic groups. Women's bodies are policed in the name of tradition. Policing women's bodies and behavior is an attempt to preserve the past amidst the constant transformation of social norms. It becomes, for immigrant communities, the main means of asserting moral superiority over the host culture, and it gives the feeling that not all is changing. Groups that are transforming their way of life through a vast and deep process of acculturation focus on preserving tradition almost exclusively through the gender roles of women. Women's bodies become the site of struggles concerning disorienting cultural differences. Gender becomes the site to claim the power denied to immigrant men by racism. It is as if the immigrants' psychological sense of safety and their sense of self depended on a sharp contrast between two sets of cultural values. The preservation of old versions of women's roles becomes central to this sharp contrast. For people who experience a deep lack of control over their daily lives, controlling women's behaviors becomes a symbolic demonstration of orderliness and continuity. Obviously, it is easier for immigrants to maintain control over their private world than over their public lives. Work schedules, types of work and schooling, and the structures of daily life are controlled by the customs and demands of the new society. But in the private of their homes, they can seek to maintain the sense that they're still in control. This is why frequently women themselves join actively in adhering to traditions that, from the point of view of outsiders, appear to curtail their own freedoms and opportunities for self-fulfillment. Pressures on immigrant women's roles and sexuality also emerge from cultural values and attitudes present in the host society, which imposes its own burdens and desires on immigrant women through prejudices and racism. While returning women to their traditional roles continues to be defined as central to preserving national identity and cultural pride by some immigrants, those same values and behaviors are perceived by their hosts as demonstrations of immigrants' backwardness and need for change. Yet, another oppressive force comes from people eager to be culturally sensitive. Under the guise of respect, some members of the host society may racialize and exoticize immigrant women, particularly those who come from non-European countries. Tragically, they contribute to the oppression of immigrant women in the name of respecting their culture and preserving their values. Frequently, when outsiders to a given cultural group are trying to be sensitive, they attribute behaviors that would be unacceptable in members of the majority culture as being part of the culture of this group. This perspective can distort efforts to enhance cultural awareness into dangerously destructive practices for women, even more so because they're carried out with such good intentions. Needless to say, these attitudes have a serious impact in the provision of ethical and effective services for women immigrants and refugees. And we shall come back to this topic later in the presentation. Okay, let's talk now a little bit more about specifically domestic violence. It is a common belief that there's a larger incidence of domestic violence among immigrant and refugee populations. It is also believed that immigrant women suffer high rates of battering because they may come from cultures that accept domestic violence. So let's a few statistics to see how figures play out. In a study of 280 immigrant Latina women, it was found that 136 women reported experiences of physical abuse by their intimate partner, whereas 33 women, reported experience of psychological abuse. A recent study in New York City found that 51% of intimate partner homicide victims were foreign-born. The National Council for Research on Women documented that nearly half of immigrant women surveyed experienced domestic violence, and this violence intensified after the relocation, probably due to the evolving family dynamics that may increase the levels of stress and in turn result in increased incidences of domestic violence. In other words, yes, there may be more violence in some immigrant communities, but the violence seems to have increased after the relocation. So it's not something that came with the culture, it's something that was created or was increased, not created, by the increased levels of stress and the need of men to say, I'm in command here. When we look at data on domestic violence from the general population, we discover that 3 to 4 million women are beaten in their homes by their husbands, ex-husbands, and male lovers every year. And that domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 and 40 in the United States, more than car accidents, rapes, and muggings combined. Approximately 95% of victims of domestic violence are women, and one woman is beaten by her husband or partner every 15 seconds in the United States. So since I started talking, a number of women, wherever in the country, have been beaten up by their male partners. In the year 2000 only, 1,247 women were killed by an intimate partner. In recent years, an immigrant partner killed approximately 33% of all female murder victims, and males were 83% of spouse murderers. In other words, it's not that women are killed out there by strangers. They're killed at home or someplace else by their male. Among the US military, rates of marital aggression are considered 3 to 5 times higher than civilian rapes. An average of 45 to 48 homicides occur every year in the armed force. Domestic violence homicides. 75% to 84% of the alleged offenders in cases of spouse physical abuse are honorably discharged. As we can see from this limited number of examples, domestic violence is regretfully a widespread problem among all US populations, not only a cultural issue pertaining to immigrants or even necessarily more prevalent among them. However, the reality is that immigrant-specific factors exacerbate the already vulnerable position of immigrant women in domestic violence situations. A review of scholarship reveals that the incidence of domestic violence is not higher than it is in the negative population, but rather than the experiences of immigrant women in domestic violence situations are often exacerbated by their specific position as immigrants, such as limited language skills, isolation from family and community, lack of access to dignified jobs, uncertain legal status, and experiences with authorities in their countries of origin that make them distrust authorities here. Concerns and fears such as visa status or fear of deportation for self or the spouse may prevent immigrant and refugee women from asking for help. Especially difficult is the situation of women who are undocumented immigrants who are experiencing domestic violence. Women who reside in the US without documents are least likely to seek help and protection from domestic violence. Moreover, abusers often use their partner's immigration status as a tool of control. They may subject her to constant threats of deportation, threatening to report her to the authorities, so they deport her and he can keep the children. They may destroy important documents such as passport or identification cards, or make constant derogatory comments about her or her culture and race. And it is important to note here that the abusive partners of immigrant women are sometimes US-born white men. So, again, is it their culture? Or is it their position and their immigration status? The US federal government has made provisions for women and their children who are abused with the passage of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 and the Battered Immigrant Women Protection Act of 1999, the goal of which is to remove immigration laws as a barrier that kept battered women and children, immigrant women and children, locked in abusive relationships. Although new laws provide a temporary visa status and protections against deportation to undocumented immigrant women and children who are experiencing domestic violence in their homes, multiple barriers continue to exist for women who find themselves in this situation in seeking and obtaining legal and other forms of help. Lack of language skills, ignorance of the law, and lack of access to resources practically nullify the provisions of the law. Shelters sometimes are concerned about the legal or funding consequences of serving battered immigrant women, despite the fact that non-profit organizations are explicitly exempt from verifying immigration status as a condition for service. But even when they are willing to provide services, language barriers may prevent them from doing so because they may not have bilingual personnel who can communicate with the women. There are yet other barriers to the provision of services for battered immigrant women. Sometimes outsiders to a given cultural group, trying to become sensitive to cultural differences, as I said before, may attribute behaviors they would consider unacceptable in members of the same mainstream culture to being part of the culture of one or another immigrant women. In an effort to manage some of the guilt generated by largely unacknowledged racism, it is possible to forget that sexism is no more deserving of respect when it is spoken in other languages or dressed in other cultural robes. Similarly, racism is not to be tolerated in the name of advancing rights. The balance between these two is delicate but an absolutely necessary one. Sensitivity toward other cultures does not imply unquestioning acceptance of patriarchal definitions of cultural identities and behaviors. We should ask ourselves, why is the focus placed on women's roles than on other aspects of culture and tradition? Deployment of tradition and culture to justify sexist or racist behavior should never remain unproblematized. I am convinced that racism and sexism derive their strength from each other. Studying immigrant women from different cultural backgrounds has shown me again and again how women are made to carry cultural values at the expense of their own lives. This keeping tradition at any cost, it's not a benign manifestation of interesting traditions. It can cost women their lives. These culture-specific meta-narratives can become tools of oppression or justification for it. Prejudices also influence how immigrant women are represented in psychological science. Societal intolerance has made many social scientists to narrowly conceptualize immigrant women as oppressed and helpless, and to disregard women's strength, resilience, resourcefulness, and community networks. It will be very easy to assume that most poor, uneducated women immigrants do not understand the meaning and subtleties of women's oppression. It will be easy to dismiss any woman who expresses concern or opposition to male domination by labeling her as a traitor who has sold herself to American influence. The reality is that in all cultures, US and European cultures included, there will be resistance to women's transformation of their roles by those invested in maintaining the status quo. But in all immigrant groups, women are perfectly capable of undertaking this transformative task. Those who have a stake at preventing the development of consciousness among women will not be pleased when those women take their lives in their own hands. And again, sometimes apparently cultural sensitivity is nothing but another variety of racism that in fact fosters a conservative politics which locks women in the past. Some of these practices perpetuate the colonial gaze and reinforce exclusionary practices used by those who have a vested interest in keeping women outside of critical sites of power over their own lives. Indeed, when trying to understand other cultures, we need to reflect about the implications of maintaining a customary system that targets mainly women. We need to reflect on the implications of showing respect for customs that target mainly women and have serious consequences for the right to bodily and emotional integrity. The question is how we preserve sensitivity and respect for others and their cultural differences while continuing to foster liberatory, emancipatory ideals and principles applicable to all oppressed groups, not just to some with exclusion of others. It is not enough to be supportive in efforts at liberation from ethnic oppression if women's gender oppression is not taken into consideration. The guilt generated by failure to acknowledge racism or sexism can become impediment to transform our consciousness about these issues. Perhaps if we reflect on how we address our own sexism, racism, classism, heterosexism, and other isms in a more careful way, we would be more able to refine our understanding and manifest a more authentic cultural sensitivity. Let me try to say this using a concrete example, as any other. There are a number of Somali and Ethiopian immigrants in San Diego, in a particular area of the city, and there have been a number of cases of genital mutilation of girls right there. And some of those cases have come to the attention of authorities. This is, child abuse. And people who defend some of these say, well, what is their culture? And what I always say is, okay, it is their culture also for men to walk their goats around with a stick in their own country. But, and there's a big street around the area where they live. If some of those Somali men would walk their goats around El Cajon Boulevard, the police will immediately send them home and say, your goats go to your backyard. You cannot be walking in the middle of the street. That's their culture also. So why is it that we think they have the right to preserve their culture when it is impacting women's body integrity, but they have to adapt to our cultures when it's other aspects of the culture? And why is it that they are willing to stop walking goats in the middle of the street, but they're not willing to stop doing genital mutilation in girls? So it's tradition, yeah, but why is it that we keep damaging traditions that always affect women? And we do not keep other traditions that are actually innocent, because if you walk your goats on the sidewalk, you wouldn't be interfering with anybody, supposedly. Okay? So there's something going on there that has to do with male power and privilege, more than just with cultural sensitivity. And people who want to be culturally sensitive frequently say, it's the culture. Wait a minute, why is that? Why it gets preserved in their culture? And we need to think about what's the case. On the one hand, we understand the complexities and nuances of human diversity, and we realize that we can no longer speak of generic women or force our own version of the good life on women from different cultural backgrounds. Moreover, each group contains its own diversity. There's usually more in-group diversity than there is within group diversity as such. But paradoxically, some efforts to enhance cultural awareness may become dangerously destructive for women. Concretely, in my consultation and training activities concerning immigrant communities, health professionals or educators often tell me that wife abuse is part of these people's culture, implying that it should be tolerated. My response is always the same. wife abuse is also part of mainstream US culture. And we would not dream of advocating tolerance for it in mainstream US culture. And that's what I'm saying, it's subtle racism. These poor people don't know any better, so they can go beat up their wives. However, acceptance of violence against women as an outlet for frustration or as a legitimate reaction to this men's own oppression is unjustifiable and immoral. And it should not be cloaked in the mantle of cultural sensitivity. And of course, if we dig a little bit deeper, what is this need for recognition of manhood but another manifestation of sexism? As a matter of fact, a common legal problem contributing to difficulties in women's struggles to gain protection from violence is that culture is used in court as a defense against the victims of domestic violence. Defense lawyers come in and say, well, it's this culture, that's why, it's his culture, that's why he beat her up. Therefore, he shouldn't go to jail because it's his culture. Okay. Obviously, again, wife abuse is also part of mainstream US culture. I sometimes wonder, why is it that we can be aware and sensitive to the flaws in traditional Western ways, but feign blindness to the same issues in other cultures? Or just say, it's their culture. Why is it okay to be respectful of things in other traditions that we believe damage women and want to change in our own traditions? In other words, underlying or apparent cultural sensitivity may be an arrogant assumption that women from other cultures cannot think and cannot understand and cannot free themselves from patriarchal bondage. Our notions of culture are frequently based on a form of preserving otherness and difference that may involve our need to see others as picturesque, even though it may be at their own expense. Ultimately, the question is, who owns immigrant women's lives? Modern ideas about women's rights and free choices concerning their lives have not entirely replaced more traditional ideas about gender obligation and differences in rights. These questions are alive in all societies, yet they become more poignant for immigrant groups trying to acculturate in a new context that is itself in transition concerning the roles of women. The established norms for women's appropriate behavior suffer constant transformation in both the home culture and the host culture. Immigrant women and girls develop their identity against the backdrop of these contradictions. Anthropology Immanuel Todd believes that the defining factor in the adjustment, let me just flip to the first. Anthropologist Immanuel Todd believes that the defining factor in the adjustment of immigrants is the social status of women. He sees the freedom or lack of it afforded to women as the most important indicator of the quality of the experience of migration for any group. The United Nations unequivocally states in documents concerning the status of women, immigrant, and refugees that improving the status of women is increasingly recognized as fundamental to improving the basic human rights of over half the population of the world, and also contributes to social economic progress. Women's migration, both internally within the country, within developing countries, and internationally across borders to developed countries, is inextricably linked to the status of women in society and of groups in general. And issues of domestic violence are an extremely important component of the status of women in any society. Okay, that's what I have to say. Questions?